characters depicted in this video are fictional. Any similarity to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Damsel is a horror brew made by me and a fan-made minor character of the creepypasta game Mario.exe. Some of the information in this video will be reiterated from her horror brew page, which will be linked in the description. But other pieces of information will be entirely new and expanded upon for any people unsure of who she is. First and foremost, the idea in itself. I was fascinated by the world building and the potential that the Mario.85 creepypasta had. With so many fan interpretations and different twists on Sonic.exe to the point that I couldn't even keep up with them without getting confused, I actually wanted to contribute more to the Mario side of the community, often nicknamed the Horror Brew community, thanks to its character fan Wikipedia of the same name. Frazdude, who was MX's partial creator at the time before transferring his ownership completely to their co-creator, Is Damsel, emphasised the role of Lucas, MX's victim whom you play as in the game. While planning Damsel's written portrayal, I asked Is Damsel myself if MX is particularly focused on Lucas, or if it's because he was learning to play in his game. I was unsure if the content I'd be writing would be in character, as I heard from some sources that MX was a gentleman to anyone who wasn't his poor victim, while other sources told me he was a bloodthirsty entity, just wanting to trap people in his game to play with and torture them, regardless of who they were. She informed me that MX would deliver the same fate to anyone playing his game, and Lucas's capture happened by chance. Because the creepypasta takes place in the mid-1980s, I came up with the idea of MX taking the modern route and targeting a new victim through the means of the 2020s. Some of you guys are beginning to catch on that I am simply playing a character. Who I am in real life is not the same character as Duffy, and with the YouTube video that I'd already released of Duffy playing the game, people questioned what would happen if MX took an interest in this foul-mouthed, hysterical wannabe gamer. I felt as if making your own version of an antagonist was a bit overdone, and seeing as how there weren't many victims on the Horror Brew wiki, I actually wanted to create a victim myself. Something happening to Duffy was an idea already suggested to me by one of my mutuals, Mixcellaneous. So, for just a laugh, on the 11th of February 2024, Damsel was born. Damsel's disguise design was based on the appearance of Princess Toadstool, or Princess Peach, from the 1985 Super Mario Bros. Game. I also took some inspiration from Toadstool's westernised design from the Super Mario Bros. 3 cartoon. In her disguised form, she talks with an American accent, and sounds similar to how Peach does in the cartoon.
The Sledge Brothers are breaking you out of here.
Which is convincing unless you listen carefully. Her voice occasionally buzzes and glitches, and despite the falsified accent she puts on to remain disguised as Peach, she will accidentally let out British mannerisms, which would sound strange to the player. Damsel will go out of her way to pretend to be a figure of royalty for the victims that come her way, though when she talks to MX, she puts in no effort at all, and speaks in a normal British accent. I like the idea of Damsel unpredictably switching between accents and mannerisms because it represents her inability to maintain an identity now that she is reduced to a victim of MX. Damsel's facial expression is also somewhat sullen, as if someone else is wearing the princess's face as a mask. One thing that stood out to me about her design was that her sprite continuously pointed to the left. I took that aspect myself and made that a reoccurring theme of Damsel's appearance and also something relevant to her character. As you can see on both the old and the new concept reference, Damsel always points to the left. I wanted this to be a subtle warning for the player to not proceed forward, because unless she is spoken to, Damsel cannot speak, the equivalent of when you talk to an NPC in a game. If the player decides to ignore her, she can still gesture before her attempts to warn the player become more frantic, but we will get to that part in a moment. Originally, all the information about her were only on a few concept doodles. Yet somehow this character managed to gain a bit of traction in the Horror Brew community, and that's when I decided to add more. Though my idea was playing around with MX capturing a YouTuber, a lot of their interactions are also based on the idea of what would happen if a victim was an adult. In my version of the story, Damsel is MX's second victim, and also his first victim who is of age. A lot of creepypasta characters, such as Slenderman and Hypno, will often target children simply because they are easier to manipulate, as well as being free sadistic entertainment with how easily they can break or give the hysterical reaction that they want. Adults, on the other hand, develop different coping mechanisms and interesting ways of reacting to torment, whether physical or psychological. Their fear is likely to have more depth. The awful things in the world are not censored or dumbed down for them to understand. They know what evil is capable of. The worst thing that a child Lucas's age would hear would be to not talk to strangers, or else they'll be taken away and never see their family again. Kids are more inclined to react like animals, and will immediately resort to the flight instinct rather than self-defence. My portrayal of MX is that he's as despicable as he is, he still has a variety of attention-seeking behaviour, and will always try to evolve his games to make the scenario more enjoyable and interesting for him. In Damsel's story, MX is becoming experimental. He wants a backup punching bag while he figures out what to do with Lucas, whether it's reviving him to kill him over and over, or allowing him to roam and overthink himself into oblivion, before surprising him and chasing him down again, constantly feeding on his fear. This is where his attention turns to Duffy. Duffy's Let's Play of Mario 85 had performed decently for a new channel, so I added that into the story to purposely add to the atmosphere, though the fictional aspect is slightly different. In the story, Duffy comes across the game of her own accord, through rumours that a demon is inhabiting it. She dismissed the story as a marketing ploy and an attempt at fear-mongering to gain traction. She wanted to play the game herself, as she's rather enthusiastic when it comes to haunted gaming, as originally nicknamed by the YouTuber Some Ordinary Gamers. Duffy pirates the game from a mysterious website and uploads the video that you can see on my channel. As we all know, piracy is no party. Amused by her foul language, her natural charisma, and the fact that she managed to beat his game alone, MX set his sights on Duffy. Keep in mind, with the story taking place in early 2024, MX would have been tormenting Lucas for nearly 40 years. At first, MX started to harass Duffy through her technology, predominantly leaving messages on her phone and her social media. This is also referenced at the beginning of the Let's Play itself.
I'm coming for you, Duffy.
Although she was unnerved about how someone managed to get her contact details, Duffy dismissed this, assuming that this was just a bored troll trying to get a reaction out of her. If you're going to gain more of a following, trolls are going to become a thing, and it will be something she would have to get used to. Being on the internet from a very young age, she took the advice that people should always take with the online experience. Don't feed the trolls. Any attempt from MX to contact her would simply be ignored. Unfortunately, as much as my writing does depict MX with tendencies similar to a troll, a demonic entity isn't going to grow bored if he's already set his sights on a victim. MX took this personally, and instead of going with his original plan to harass her and lure her in himself, he decided to strike at the most convenient time. In the early hours of the 11th of February 2024, a few weeks after her upload, MX observed Duffy enjoying her time online. With the pirated Mario 85 file still on her computer, the entity hijacked her laptop and tripped the wires, electrocuting the young woman to death. Duffy's body would be found burned and crumpled on her bedroom floor next to her desk. With his new victim attained, MX ripped the soul out of her body and forced it into the pixelated body of Princess Toadstool, giving her the role of the Damsel in his game. However, even with the role placed on her, Damsel shouldn't be underestimated. One key quality is her ability to adapt to her surroundings, as well as her quick thinking. After a few nasty encounters with MX herself, she was able to pick up on what made the entity more aggressive. Damsel was often able to hide and observe everything going on within the game. She saw Luigi being pursued by this beast, and realised that Lucas was also a real person trapped within his game. What unnerved her the most was how easily MX changed from being amused to provoked within seconds. His mood would flip like a switch, a trait I emphasised with my portrayal of him based on real-life sadists. Her time in this world wasn't going to be great, but she would have to make her circumstances less severe. Similar to her human counterpart, Damsel is sarcastic and cold with a rather morbid sense of humour, likely being a coping mechanism for her situation. She dislikes being vulnerable, often hiding her true feelings to the point she could be mistaken for being unempathetic. However, Damsel decided to play the role that MX gave her, trying to be as bland and uninteresting as possible. This is a real-life method used by victims towards their antagonisers, a term known as grey rocking. Damsel will go out of her way to manipulate MX, often playing more into the side of him that is entertained rather than activating his predatory instinct to kill. In some circumstances, this works. MX is far too busy coming up with methods to torment Lucas rather than fixating on her, and he often grows bored dealing with her and will go off elsewhere. Though to claim that he wouldn't enact torment on her at all would be a lie. Damsel and MX's relationship is pretty odd. One question that would understandably come up would be, well, why doesn't he just kill her? Well, Damsel would usually be good at hiding her emotions, though she was not perfect and sometimes she would allow them to slip, often muttering insults under her breath. MX could sense this, and when he wasn't going after Lucas, he'd satisfy his boredom by deliberately trying to torment and provoke Damsel. He wanted to see how much he could terrify and traumatise the young woman, though for once, the entity would be surprised. Damsel would be provoked, but when angered she'd shout and swear at him, which is not something he has ever dealt with from a victim. MX wasn't only just fascinated, but he also found it hilarious, and in the story, as much as he's very dismissive of her, he gradually shifts his attention towards her simply because he finds her interesting, hence why he doesn't intend on killing her. Not permanently anyway. You could likely call MX a reactive abuser, deliberately trying to upset her to turn it back around on her and find an excuse to punish her. MX is a very bad influence on Damsel, and due to his harassment, she has learned how to become a fantastic actress for the sake of keeping him off of her back. In more comedy-based portrayals of the two, they will bicker with one another on a regular basis, with MX even trying to murder her for her backtalk. To make her living conditions easier to bear, Damsel distracts her mind by cleaning up after the rampages that MX goes on. She will often find the many corpses of Lucas's sprites, dispose of them, and clean up the bloodstains and gore left behind. However, the violent entity also left behind the bodies of toads that he would kill for fun, whether it was out of boredom or simply crushing them by accident while chasing Lucas. One day, after trying to dispose of a dead toad, she accidentally decapitated it, emitting some sort of odd energy from her palms. The head of the toad contorted and changed into something very familiar to her, and then it hit her. MX never had any power-ups within his game. She assumed that this was to make the game unfair for Lucas, and if he was intent on removing any advantages, she thought that MX must have some weakness, right? She picked up the mushroom and swallowed it. And then she barfed it straight back up, her body rejecting it. The smell was foul. She was basically eating the equivalent of rotting flesh. But Damsel wasn't deterred. She knew what she had just done. She just needed to perfect it. After all, she couldn't afford to just give up. When she had the opportunity to be alone, Damsel would practice this ability, decapitating the toads while cleaning up and trying to perfect the skill. She would fail over and over. But one day, after a particularly nasty encounter with MX, Damsel's pent-up anger finally took a toll, and she experienced a mental breakdown. She screamed and cried, cursing her murderer while repeatedly beating the corpse of a toad in a fit of rage. After tearing off its head, her hands glowed, and finally a super mushroom appeared in her hands. As the glow illuminated the corner she was working on, recognition also flashed within her mind. She had done it. Staring at the mushroom in awe, Damsel quickly took the power up and swallowed it. She felt energy immediately rise within her. She felt taller, stronger. A new wave of optimism invaded her mind. She realised she was able to make things that MX had restricted. If she could make super mushrooms, she must be able to make other power-ups too. So this was now the source of her motivation and a glimmer of hope that she may be able to escape. This also explains why I sometimes draw Damsel short and chibi-like in some drawings, while in others I depict her as taller and more confident. The super mushroom hadn't only granted Damsel an unusual spark of energy, but her intense emotions also provoked her and gave her the ability to transform, triggered by her first encounter with Lucas. With the boy refusing to heed her recommendation of hiding from MX, she let her temper get the better of her, and transformed into a rather manic and obsessive entity, nicknamed Distress. Lucas, afraid of her shift in behaviour, fled for his life. Distress is Damsel's second form, and it's usually triggered by frustration, the equivalent of a tantrum with things not going her way. Damsel also stopped speaking in her falsified American accent and will go back to speaking in her real British accent. Her form is the equivalent of MX's pipe crawler form, though unlike him, distress will not kill the player if making contact. Instead, she will shove the player back while walking towards them, a more aggressive approach of trying to get them to turn around. Distress does not have as much control over her thinking as she does when she is Damsel, and she will deliberately play up the creepy and intimidating behaviour as a desperate attempt to keep you away from MX. Her behaviour is similar to that of Mania, being full of energy yet easily irritated. There are two sources of motivation for this. If the player, or Lucas, returns back into hiding, MX will be distracted by this and will continue to search for them, giving her more time to focus on her own plans of making power-ups behind his back. However, deep down, she is not the unempathetic and nasty individual she makes herself out to be. In some way, she is trying to protect you. She just has a rather pessimistic view of your capabilities and assumes that any encounter with MX will result in failure to escape and imminent death. She may be morally questionable, but she is not evil and doesn't want to see you suffer, even if she is selfish enough to allow MX to search for you to keep him away from her. Lucas in the story will grow more stubborn with a natural instinct to escape. After an instant where he successfully got past distress, his brief hope of getting to the goal was shattered when the young woman escalated her attempts to scare him off. He didn't see Distress emerging out of the darkness, but someone completely different. Distress had become Duffy. Named after her known alias before she passed, Duffy is Damsel's final form and her personal equivalent to MX. She looks somewhat similar to how she did as a human, though any pigment with the exception of her ball gown has disintegrated, making her look similar to a walking corpse. Some of my followers had questioned what the markings on her dress were in previous concept art. These are veins, referencing the fact that just like MX, Duffy's clothes are flesh infused. It's easy to forget that she's a spirit possessing a virtual form, and you can also faintly see these veins beginning to form on her distress counterpart. The crown, as much as it resembles one, technically isn't a crown. It's part of her head, similar to horns just fused together. Damsel loses her sense of identity in this form, only prioritised with you. This is arguably her favourite form amongst my viewers, simply because it makes her more identifiable as a horror brew. Duffy is a lot stronger, and she will go berserk if you attempt to get towards the goal, violently lashing out at you to try and scare you to flee. Get out of here would likely be what she would yell at you, ironically in contrast to MX's come back here, and it would be constant, combined with yells of run and go in order to keep the player on edge. Naturally, when being exposed to this for the first time, your instincts are going to get the better of you, and you will flee with her chasing you. Duffy is violent in this form, her strength capable of shattering the pipes and the brickwork as she tries to chase you back to the start. Anyone exposed to this and deciding to run back to the start would likely hate her for it, when they realise they're basically back to square one, and will need to somehow find a way to evade her. However, even as the unstable Duffy, Damsel still has a conscience. Unlike other horror brews, Damsel has no kill count. She has no desire to genuinely hurt any victims of MX that she comes across, so if she kills you by accident, I imagine that her sprite would have a look of horror when she realises you're actually dead by her hand. Damsel will feel a sense of dread and guilt when realising that she is now a murderer. I have considered working with this concept in the story, particularly to show MX's more manipulative side, toying with her head on how she's becoming just like him. Damsel's most well-known quote is, "I cannot be saved and neither can you," which references the desire for a hero to save a damsel from her captor. This also refers to her constant attempt to push you away, telling you to not bother trying to rescue her, for it is pointless. This quote would be given when Damsel would transform into Distress to try and scare Lucas. I'd like to remind my viewers that this character is fan-made, therefore she is not technically canon in the story made by Frazdude and Razdazzle. However, I still like to make my interpretation relevant to the original Mario 85 creepypasta. If Damsel was canon, she would likely be considered a minor character, maybe the deuteragonist or tritagonist if she was lucky. Lucas would be the protagonist, and MX would be the antagonist. Keep in mind that in the original story, Lucas's Uncle Mark would probably play an important role too. At the end of the day, this is Lucas's story, so if Raz did accept Damsel's character, she likely wouldn't appear often. For now, I'd consider her existence an AU, so my work involving her would simply be the what if of Damsel's story while she's hiding around during the game. Many people have already made their own sprite animations based on how they'd see her in the Mario 85 game. Some have even depicted her as a helper to Lucas, giving him super mushrooms when MX isn't looking. If any potential victims played the game, individuals who suffer from emotional or psychological mental disorders would be able to sense a presence more easily than the average person. This is Damsel desperately trying to warn you not to continue. Sadly, this almost always fails. Damsel has also crossed over with other Horror Brew characters, an example of this being her relationship with Allfather, the antagonist of mario.exe reimagined. With Allfather's desire to get to know whomever he encounters, combined with Damsel's need for company in an isolated dystopian world, the two share a mutual interest in one another, likely being considered acquaintances. Allfather has gradually been able to crack open Damsel's cold exterior to get her to open up to him, simply because he has stuck around and persisted with conversation. Unlike other Horror Brews, Allfather can detect that Damsel is not as helpless as she makes herself out to be, but being so fascinated with humanity means that he can sense her loneliness. As much as he doesn't go out of his way to protect her from MX, Allfather has become a source of useful information, and she will often listen to his advice on how to survive. Damsel's character is an example of why perseverance is so important. Despite her dire situation, she has not lost hope, and she is still adapting and finding a way to survive while preventing MX from finding out about her special ability. The story continuing from here is deliberately left open to interpretation, but I am intending on possibly creating more media if people continue to be interested in her, this likely being a comic illustrating her day-to-day life in her virtual prison. I also wanted to make a character that showed the importance of emotional strength as much as physical strength. This is a great narrative approach for character development, showing them gaining experience as they recover from traumatic events, quite similar to real life when battling with mental illness or recovering from abuse. When writing Damsel's portrayal, I was somewhat inspired by Sansa Stark from Game of Thrones. Both characters have a theme of royalty, and both have experienced severe hardship as a consequence. However, Sansa is one of my favourite characters from the series, simply because of her power of perseverance and her ability to adapt and learn from her previously naive and trusting outlook. Sansa may have been one of the more inexperienced characters in the beginning, but she is definitely one of the most intelligent characters by the end. She has been exposed to the majority of the worst people in the series, and she can see straight through other people's bullshit. I intend to give Damsel the same approach. She will gradually evolve from a clueless and traumatised girl to a smart, cunning princess by learning from her enemy throughout the story, constantly finding herself in more difficult circumstances and having to adapt to overcome them. One of MX's fan-made quotes is, "Innocence doesn't get you far." I'd say it does, because when it's destroyed, they have no mercy left. When they've been hurt trying to be the best, they become the worst. And then there's no hurting them. Not anymore. So, that's my introduction on Damsel. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. A reminder yet again that if you want to see more information on Damsel, check out our article on the House of Horror Brews wiki down below. I've tried my best to credit all artists in this video. I still can't get over the kindness and generosity of this fandom for such talented work. I also have a lovely piece right here by Pinkady Parade on X. Please give him some support, his work is simply adorable. Thank you so much, I really appreciate it. Please share any suggestions about any future videos involving Damsel in the comments if you're interested in seeing more, or simply if you have any ideas for content in general. Feedback is important to me, and I want to entertain you. With that, nighty night, arseholes.